something else about the soup suppers. Just occurred to me the other day that our first soup supper took place 7 years ago. And we've been doing them ever since. And that first soup supper was held at Bill Daly's Hacienda Spa. And what we did, it was about his Desert Hot Springs postcard collection. Now, have we come full circle? Because now we have our postcard book out, Postcards of the Desert. And, we started 7 years ago with a postcard collection. And I remember I made the soup from a recipe I got out of the newspaper, and Alta made the salad, and it was a fun thing. But anyway, here we are tonight. And I want to thank those of you who are not members but came for the event and came from out of town. And we really appreciate having you here. Our program tonight, and I always have the delightful opportunity of introducing the speakers. 2 people from Cabot. Am I holding this wrong? I hear that.
There's too much music still going on. It's too close to your own.
Yeah, there is too much music. That's crazy. We're fixing that. But can you hear? So I can talk maybe about the music for just a minute here. Okay, Richard Brown and Judy Gigante. And I had heard what an incredible presentation that they gave. And of course I've known Judy probably for the 7 years she's been involved at Cabot's. We were there together. Richard has been involved for 5 years. But their bios are so much the same that I'm only going to give one because it fits for both of them. They're both on Cabot's board. They're both docents. And they both are founding members of the Foundation's Historical Committee. And Richard edited the first and second editions of On the Desert since 1913, the book that's out there, which is Cabot's writing and is absolutely delightful. If you have not seen it, you really should look at it. And also, Judy was involved, the same thing. Now, Judy has gone to Alaska to research Cabot because part of his life, was in Alaska, his wonderful adventures there. So she has new discoveries, and tonight that's what we get to hear about. New discoveries that we never knew existed. So I'd like to present Judy Gigante and Richard Brown.
Thanks, everybody. What a treat to be able to speak to this group tonight. And it's going to be all about new discoveries at Cabot's. And before I launch into our presentation, I wanted to make a presentation. We received from Cabot's granddaughter the 3rd anniversary edition of the Desert Sentinel, which was printed in August of 1944. It came to us as the original paper, and we have digitized it. And tonight, Jeff would like to present that image to you. It's an amazing paper. It's got all kinds of wonderful ads and all in it, and some great stories about the desert. So I'm sure it'll be a benefit to the museum, and thank you. Okay, well, the story of Cabot Yerxa and his pueblo is probably pretty familiar to most people in this room. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Probably pretty familiar with most people here in this room. As a matter of fact, those stories have been told here in Desert Hot Springs by Cabot himself, Cole, many, many other people for well over 60 years. And pretty much those stories haven't changed. Then in February 2012, on the island of Kauai, new discoveries and new stories were learned. Cabot's granddaughter lives on the island of Kauai, and I visited her there at her home. And following that interview, she sent me back with boxes of new photographs, new stories, wonderful documents, things I had never seen before. Now, the history committee at Cabot's had just been formed a couple months prior to that. And when we started to look at these documents, we knew we had something extraordinary. So we sat down and we started to scan, and we started to transcribe, and we started to document everything that we had. And just about the time we were able to catch our breath, she sent us more things. And we were on a roll. And then, based on all this new information, we began to do some outside research, of course, jumping into the web on some of the things we learned. We did interviews, and we traveled. Some of us went to Bertilla, spent time at the Historical Museum there, going through old newspapers. Pat Larson spent extensive amount of time in Seattle doing research. Barbara Barron went to the Nikolai Feshin Museum in New Mexico. And I went to Nome. Nome, Alaska. What a treat, what a treat. By November of 2012, we had pretty much put a number of these news stories together. And we were about to change some of those old 60-year stories forever. And that's kind of what we're about tonight. We're going to show you we're going to show you about 100 photographs. Show you some new photographs of Cabot's early life in Hamilton and Minnesota. Tell you some news stories about Alaska. And show you some photographs of Cuba that have never been seen before. But the biggest revelation is what happened here when he was a homesteader. Something totally new that nobody knew before. So hold your breath. Most of the photographs we're going to show you tonight are Cabot's. There's a couple of professional photographs in here, but for the most part, all of these photographs came from Lori's collection. We're going to cover most of these new discoveries. You could be here all night. We went through all of them, but we're going to highlight most of them. And then when we're finished with our presentation, we're going to open the floor for questions and comments. So, Richard?
We'll see if this works. It seems to work. We'll find out.
Yes.
Okay, so our first photo. The early photos that I'm going to introduce before Judy takes us to Alaska will have to do with the very earliest days of Cabot Yerkes's life in North Dakota, or Dakota Territory when he lived there, and Minneapolis and St. Paul where the family was. And these photos do represent, in some cases, some real useful discoveries for the historical committee at the museum. I'll just talk to you about a couple of photographs from the town of Hamilton in Dakota Territory, where Cabot was born in 1883 and his brother Harry in 1885. I don't know if you all have memorized the biography of Cabot Yerkes like we have. Raise your hand if you know all these dates. But you're going to learn them as the show goes on tonight, because it is arranged in chronological order through Cabot's life. So I'll start with the first two photos in North Dakota, where Cabot was born in the 80s, and point out the significance here is that prior to the discovery of some information that Pat Larson, another of our committee members, put together, and also substantiated by these two photos, we know about the beginnings of the Yerkes family, what we did not know before. We were under the impression for a long time that the Yerkes, Fred and Nellie, Cabot's father, were living on an Indian reservation and running a trading post for the Indians when Cabot was born. And look at this photo here with this house, and look at the writing at the top. Cabot and Harry were born in this house, Hamilton, Dakota, 1883. Cabot 1883, Harry 1885. Actually, what we know now is that the store that Fred Yerkes was running was in the town of Hamilton. Cabot himself wrote about this part of his life, probably from memory, because the family only lived there for the first 3 years of Cabot's life, so we think probably what he wrote later was what he remembered from his parents' stories, and how much of this was actually visual memory on his part, I don't know. Anyway, he did write some things that are confusing and a bit contradictory, but the research Pat did, plus these photos, do tell us the story. Hamilton was a little frontier town, just kind of on the edge of civilization during an agricultural boom promoted by the railroad going into the Dakota territories. And the Yerkes were out there at the beginning trying to make a living. And this was the birthplace of Cabot, 1883. So not an Indian reservation, but just a little town on the frontier. Okay. And then the next one. There we are. In 1886, then, when Cabot was only 3, and his brother Harry even younger, the family moved from Hamilton into Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Fred, the father, with 2 of his brothers, other Yerkes brothers, started grocery stores, first in Minneapolis and then in St. Paul, and within 15 years they had made a sort of fortune. Minneapolis-St. Paul was the frontier city for that region, and seems to have been ripe for a grocery store empire to be developed, and the Yerkes brothers knew how to do it. So the photographs here, the first one, is something not known to us until recently, but it's good to show us the prosperity of the Yerkes family. This is Fred and Nellie wearing this startling dress that you see her in. And Cabot is in front here, dressed up for the photo. His mother did dress him up in amazing ways for little boy photos sometimes. And you can also see the prosperity of this kind of upper middle class house in St. Paul where they live. And there is another photo right up here over the mantle. I don't know if you can see it in the next room. We also have an image of that now in our collection, and it is a professional photo of Nellie and her 2 boys up there, but they have a full-size blow-up of it. So then the next. We have a series of photos, and I'll go through these rather quickly. Actually, just kind of go through them as we're talking. We have a series of professional photographs of one of the Yerkes stores in Minneapolis. This is not the store that Fred Yerkes, Cabot's father, ran in St. Paul, but it's a Yerkes Brothers store, which would have involved Fred's 2 brothers, with a delivery wagon with these bushel baskets, one for each family, I suppose, and then several interior shots of this really state-of-the-art grocery store in Minneapolis. I'm not sure the year that these were taken in, but sometime probably in the 1890s while they were doing great business. I love the cat in the bakery. Never run a bakery without a cat. That's what this tells me. Oh, all right. Okay. And a fish and meat market. The Yerkes stores put together their own food products. They didn't order anything from out of the area, but it was all local produce, except for the canned goods, I guess, in back. So by the time of 1902, when Fred Yerkes sold out of St. Paul and went to Cuba, you can see that owning stores like this would have brought great prosperity to the family. Okay, so we're ready to go to... This is a transitional photo to see if I look anything like Cabot Yerkes at the same age. Can you tell us apart? Probably not. I'm going to pause here before bringing Judy up to take Cabot up to Alaska in 1900 and 1901 to say a few things about the photos that are going to follow. What we saw from Cabot Yerkes' earliest life were probably professional photographs or amateur photographs that were not by Cabot Yerkes. But Cabot himself was a very enthusiastic photographer, and most of the photographs, as Judy said, that are going to follow in the rest of tonight's presentation were either taken by Cabot with his Brownie camera, or he was there with his camera and handed it off to somebody who was standing close by. So he was interested in recording the history of his own life, but he also, Barbara Marin first pointed this out to us, I think it's an important insight. Cabot had a sense of himself as a person in history. He had a feeling that he was living through big times, and he did seek to memorialize, to record certain episodes in his life with many, many photos, and he had a sense of the occasion. He didn't just record everything, but he did record a few things quite thoroughly, beginning with the trip to Alaska. The other thing I'd like to say in this little introduction to photographs mostly by Cabot has to do with the significance of these photos. This is all just an opinion piece, an editorial. Cabot himself thought of himself in terms of artistry mostly as a painter. And those of you who have toured the Pueblo or read anything about Cabot know his association with painting. That was the thing he always pushed in his life and wanted to do well. When he went to Paris in 1925, his principal object was to enroll in an art academy and become a better painter, etc., etc. He was also a pretty good writer, a journalist and a memoir writer especially, and tried his hand at fiction. I don't think he would have ever thought of presenting himself to the public as a photographer, although he was the recorder of literally hundreds, perhaps a couple of thousand important images that are now in our collection. But what I would say is, if Cabot Yerkes is going to be remembered for anything 200 years from now, it will be the photographs, which I think would be a shock to him. Number one, he had a sense of the historic moment. So the subject matter of a lot of these photographs is terrific, and will always, people will always be interested in the record that is here. Number two, the technical quality of the photographs is very high. You will see an amazing job in some cases that it'll even come over in this rather diluted form. And the other thing is, as an artist, or at least a would-be artist, he had an eye. So that sense of the right place at the right time, the right composition, it's there. So in my opinion, again, although the Pueblo Museum collection does contain a number of other interesting types of objects, to me, the treasure of our collection is really the photographs more than anything else. And if you take the tour today and see those historical photographs on display, I think you might agree.
Well, the discoveries that we made in the Laurie's collection on Nome were pretty exciting. We learned that Cabot just didn't have a cigar store. He actually built a mercantile and ran it. He actually built a roadhouse and then a stage line. And he had a cigar and candy store. So it was pretty exciting, some of the things that we had learned, and I just know you're going to love this next picture. Cabot left Seattle on the SS Centennial with his friend Ralph Boyer. That's Cabot on the far, your right, with Ralph right next to him. They left Seattle for the Aleutian Islands and anchored in Dutch Harbor because the ships going on up to Nome had to wait until the ice broke up on the Bering Sea before they could head farther north. Once the ice broke, the ships took off from Dutch Harbor, made one more stop, and that was in St. Michael. And during that time, Cabot celebrated his 17th birthday. They got into St. Michael. Ralph, come on, be good to me here. It's a wobbly table here. In St. Michael, they got on the SS Morning Star. This is the Morning Star. Take a look at the number of people on that ship. The Morning Star arrived in Nome on June 30th, 1900. Cabot and Ralph got off the ship. Try not to jiggle this. Because the waters in Nome are so shallow, these ships had to moor out at least a mile offshore And then they lightered, that's what they called it, these are lighter boats. They lightered the people and the supplies from these ships into shore, unloaded them, and then ferried those lighters back out to the ships and did it all over again. Now, Nome was mostly a town of tents when they arrived. Many of the tents that you see here were actually stores. They called them tent stores. And this is a great photograph because one of the classic spots in Nome was the sand spit that you see jutting out. The Snake River came down from the mountains, carved its way out to the Bering Sea, and left this sand spit, and it became a very prominent place in the early history of Nome. In Cabot's cigar store, excuse me, battling this darn flu right now. Cabot had a tent store. His cigar store was actually a tent store. This is a new photo we hadn't seen before. That's his cigar store up in the far right there. You can see it's a tent behind with just a wood frame in the front. But this is the most famous photograph that we have. Everybody knows this photograph. This is Cabot's cigar store. And we've learned that he ran this cigar store for about 3 months. Now, he rented it from a miner for $100 a month, $150 a month in 1900, a lot of money. But to defray the costs, he found a barber. And the barber put a bench and a chair inside his tent store there, a couple of striped poles that you can see on the outside, paid Cabot $100 a month. He set up another section for a newspaper stand. He rented that out to a newspaper guy for $25 a month. So this 17-year-old young man was out of pocket $25 a month. But he ran this cigar store for only about 3 months. Nome was growing like crazy. And pretty soon, his barber and his newspaper guy moved on to well, actually the barber became a butcher. I don't quite know how that happened. But anyway. So there's Cabot left holding the bag for this next month's rent. And then we learned that there was a really good friend of the family in town. Elwood Shirk had known the Yerkses in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, knew the family for years, and was a good friend of Cabot's. He was in Nome with his daughter Mabel. And he came up to Cabot and he said, look, I'm building my own mercantile store. I want you to help me build it. And then, of course, I know how you know how to run it because he learned the business starting at age 6. So he said, I want you to run it for me. So that's what Cabot did, built the Theobald Mercantile. We're pretty sure that the man standing in the doorway there is Elwood Shirk, and we're pretty sure that the young lady is his daughter, Mabel. There are a couple of other interesting stores or businesses in town. EJ, Lucky Baldwin, the millionaire from California, he came out to Nome and opened up the Baldwin Saloon. It was one of the fanciest saloons in all of Nome. The Hoffman House was another famous bar and hotel, but what I love in this photo is that dapper dude in the middle.
That's Guy Hahn right there. What are you doing there, Guy?
This Nome is such an eclectic town. This is such a great photograph. I love the lovely lady on his arm. Now, Nome is starting to grow like crazy. Buildings were being built just right and left, 2- and 3-story buildings. And of course, some rather unusual entertainment was coming into town, as you can see. Hewitt, the great illusionist, came into town. Cabot had written some great stories about the post office in Nome. And he would say that the line to get mail would get pretty long. So he'd stand in line, and as soon as he got close to the door, he knew somebody'd buy his spot in line. So sure enough, he'd take their money, go to the end of the line, and do it all over again. And he said it became pretty lucrative during the winter months. He made a lot of money. We never had a photograph of the post office before. This is that post office. The Dexter Saloon. That was owned by Wyatt Earp, Charles Huxley, yeah. And it was a very, very popular place in town. And Charles became a well-known and well-respected businessman in Nome for many, many years. Now, Nome was primarily made up of businessmen and miners. The Eskimo people lived in small villages outside of Nome and on some of the nearby islands. And they would come into town for supplies and for trade. But they also came in town for berries and salmon fishing. They loved the great salmon runs on the Snake River there. It's another rather interesting photograph. He's carrying what's called an ice tester. That's something that the Eskimos carry with them to make sure, or to know about the depth of the ice. When I first saw this photograph, I thought, oh my God, there's a down jacket. Well, not exactly. I learned that this jacket was made out of walrus intestine. The Eskimo people used every part of the walrus, and including the intestine. And so they would sew the intestines together to make these very lightweight jackets, which were also rainproof. So, but unfortunately they didn't last too long, maybe 3-4 wearings, and they had to make another one. But I think that's such a great photograph. Many of the Eskimos that came into Nome came in from King Island. King Island is about 80 miles outside of Nome. The King Islanders were excellent boat builders and well-respected sailors as well. And they came in these very large boats they called omiaks. That's what you see in the photograph here, and then they're hauling a smaller kayak behind. They'd come from 80 miles out. And when they came into Nome on these big omiaks, once they got to shore, they hauled these big boats up on shore, turned them on their sides, like you can see here, turned them on their sides, and that was their shelter during the time that they were in town. They would take the sails and skins and cover up the openings. Cabot said one day he saw an omiak 36 feet long come in from King Island. 22 people were on board that big omiak. In the late fall of 1900, gold was discovered in Teller, a town about 70 miles northwest of Nome. And so this started a new business because Nome's beaches were pretty much getting claimed out, so miners were anxious to get up to this new field. And they started building roadhouses and stage lines. And so L. Shirk had Cabot and 2 other guys build this roadhouse. They called it the Theobald Roadhouse, and it was located at Cape Rodney, about 30 miles out of Nome. These 3 men built this building by hand, 36 feet long, 12 feet wide. It was divided into 3 sections. One section housed the horses, the other one the dogs, and the other one the people. Once the 3 men were done building this roadhouse, one of them stayed behind, and Cabot and the other fellow went back into Nome. And they built the Theobald stage line. This is the Theobald stage line. This made weekly runs from Nome to Teller and back. The big box there, that hauled people or goods. And I think this is Cabot's shadow taking the photograph. And Cabot drove this stage line. It was also his newspaper route, because he bought newspapers in Nome. And then when they'd stop at the various mines, the camps and all, or villages, he'd jump out and sell newspapers on his way up. Cabot made friends with a number of the native people, particularly when he had his first cigar store. This was one of his closest friends, my chum from the Arctic Circle. The winter months were coming on in Nome, and it was going to be a tough winter, and Cabot wasn't exactly sure how he was going to be able to survive this winter. But he had met a number of the Eskimo people, and he joined one of the families. Joined this family and stayed with them for a number of months. He learned their ways. He learned all about their culture. They taught him their crafts and skills. He learned scrimshaw, taught him how to hunt and fish, and of course, they shared languages, and Cabot eventually became fluent in their language, and of course, he taught them English. And you know about the dictionary, right? We'll talk about that later. So he survived the winter months thanks to this family, and he wrote about it. In fact, we have 30 typewritten pages of Cabot's stories while he was in Nome. And he said, I had more fun than a barrel of monkeys, quote unquote. Once spring came around, Cabot went back into Nome. I got this photograph from the Carrie McLean Museum in Nome. I'd been corresponding with the director and her assistant there. And one day I got an email from Cheryl, the assistant. She said, hey, Judy, I was looking through our exhibits, and here in one of our cases, I saw this photograph and noticed Yerxa off here on the side. Well, I knew this wasn't the first cigar store because, wow, Nome is way, way, way bigger than it was. It's no longer a tent city. So started looking into some of the other photographs. And I found this one that Cabot took. And there's that same sign. We learned that Cabot met a friend by the name of Hood. And I zoomed in on the far left corner of that sign, and it says, Hood Candies, made daily.
Nice.
So Cabot and Hood hooked up. Hood made the candy, and Cabot had the cigars. They had their cigar and candy store, and it became a gathering place for the Eskimo people. Because, of course, Cabot was fluent in their language. And so they could come into town and find out what's going on and what to see and all of that in town. So Cabot arrived in Nome in June of 1900, and he left in October of 1901. Headed back to Minneapolis, St. Paul to be with his family and begin to work the family business. And then his dad announced the next family adventure. Richard?
This is one of those peculiarities of the Yerxa family. Cabot having been in Alaska, naturally next he would go to Cuba, as far away from Alaska as you could get in North America, I guess. And so he went to Alaska twice, the second time in 1905 for a few months, again on a commercial venture associated with his father. But in between, the Yerxa family, both parents, possibly Harry as well as Cabot, were in Cuba, I think off and on, not continuously as we used to think, from 1902 through some part of 1905 perhaps, or at least 1904. And this photo, some of you may have seen at the museum in the past. You know that this is the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor after the Spanish-American War is over. I'll just tell you briefly the story. You know that the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor was the cause of the United States declaring war on Spain and eventually seizing Cuba as temporary American possession. And after the war was over, the Maine was mostly sunk under the water level, but a little bit of it was above the water. And so it would not be difficult for Cabot to row out and take a little souvenir off of the hulk, which is on display in the museum now. We're very proud of it. So let's go.
Okay.
And we have a few photos of Cabot helping the family to lay out a housing development, and also a couple of this being him on the horse. Judy tells me the horse's name is Rick.
Dick.
Oh, all right.
Dick.
Dick.
Deek. D-E-K-E.
Oh, all right, I got it wrong. So Cabot in the jungle in Cuba, and then a couple of yes, the hacienda, either owned or rented by the parents during the time that they were doing land development there to sell to possible American immigrants. So this is Fred and Nellie looking about a decade older than they did in the photo that you saw a bit earlier, and they are on this luxurious veranda. And here they are inside with their tropical lights, living the life of foreigners who've come to make a fortune in Cuba. And then
On to the homestead years. This is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because that mic gets up, okay, so I'm old gym teacher, I got a big boomy voice, okay. So the homestead years were our biggest discoveries. Now we knew that Cabot came out to the desert in late September, early October of 1913. And we knew that he built this stone cabin as his homestead cabin. And we knew that he dug this well. And we've had this photograph on display for years at the Pueblo. Then we started going through Lori's photographs. And I found the same photograph, just a little different. That's not the stone cabin. Is that Cabot's cabin? I thought, wow, maybe. Very distinctive. If you look at the top corner there, you can see a stack at a right angle stack. That was pretty distinctive. So we started looking at other photographs. Yeah, there's that stack, there's that well, and that's Mamie by the well there. And then we found another photograph, and there's that stack, and there's that well. That's Miracle Hill. That's Miracle Hill. Then we checked out this photograph, which we'd seen many, many times, an old cabin off in the desert there. And then I zoomed in on it. Lo and behold, there's that very distinctive stack again. That's Cabot's wood frame homestead cabin. So he had two homestead cabins, two of them, the stone cabin and this wood cabin. We don't know which came first. We're still researching that. But we do know that his wife Mamie brought their son Rodney out to this cabin when he was 10 days old out of the hospital. We're confident that they lived most of their homestead years in the wood frame cabin. This is a great shot. Mamie and Rodney in the buggy outside again, that wood frame cabin. And this is a peach.
Nice.
This is Mamie on Merry Christmas, of course. Love the hat with the little flower on the side. Now, Cabot had a number of good friends while he was homesteading out here. He wrote about Dutch Frank and Old Man Coolidge, and Bill Anderson was a close friend of his, and Thornton Green, who used to meet him at the railroad station and haul all of his stuff out to his cabin. Talked a lot about the DeLongs, who owned the T-Cross K Ranch out at Mission Canyon. But one of his closest friends was Carl Eitel. And it was actually at Carl's home that Cabot met the Cahuilla man that told him about that old Indian well out near his homestead site. Another good friend was Hilda Gray. Hilda Gray was the first woman that Bob and Cabot met when they came out to the desert to homestead. There's an article in this Sentinel paper that I gave you. It was a 1916 article written by a reporter who came out to interview Hilda. Great article. Said he walked out there and saw this pretty little lady standing out in front of this house with a sign in the front that said, H.M. Gray Merchandise. Hilda had her own store out there. And in the back part was her house. A lot of the Mission Creek Indians used to come up and trade with her. She had a lot of chickens. In fact, she had a dream of having a chicken farm sometime on her homestead land. And that's her dog, Trixie. She also had a burro by the name of Babe. Cabot didn't think much of this burro. It was pretty stupid, he thought. But when Hilda finally proved up her land, Cabot bought this burro from her. And actually, it was her house that he began, once she had left, he bought it from her and he took it apart, board by board. He used some of the boards to build his trading post, and he used some of the materials to build the Pueblo.
Wow.
The newspaper matrices that we have in the water room in our Pueblo probably came from Hilda's home. So Cabot and Mamie proved up their land in June of 1917. They left the desert. Took a ship up to Seattle, where Mamie's parents were living. And Cabot and Rodney and Mamie lived with her parents for a number of years, and Richard will take it from here.
Okay, the next episode, you know that Cabot went into the Army in World War I from Seattle and served under Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, who was training the 1st Tank Corps to go over to France. They didn't make it, the armistice was signed. But Cabot had a lot of Army stories after that. And then we go to, in 1919, Fertilla, which is a bit up above Blythe. We could go maybe to the next and see the map. Closer up Blythe. And Fertilla was kind of a wide place in the road, but it was a genuine, tiny agricultural town up here, just a few miles, about 4 miles to the north of Blythe. And Cabot bought this store, an existing store, and you can just barely make out the name of the person he bought it from, Griffin. And you can see around the building a little orchard here and other buildings, so there was a little town of Fertilla. And then you get to the new sign after Cabot Yerxa has purchased the store, and he's the general merchandise guy in Little Fertilla from about 1920 until he sells out in early 1925. He was also the postmaster, and here you see the sign above the post box, which is right on that front porch on the left side of it, looking at it, and over there behind that man. This is the last photograph in the Fertilla group. Cabot said that during the time he ran this store, most of his business was conducted in Spanish rather than English. So you see it was also a tienda as well as a store. And the people in the photograph, I don't know most of them, but this is Cabot Yerxa wearing a hat probably just put on for the photograph, since he did enjoy dressing up for the photos. And the other person that we know of is this woman who is his mother, Nellie, who came out in the winters to keep house for him while he lived in Fertilla. And I think it's fascinating to see how she is dressed, although by this time the family economic situation is much different. Her husband had died in 1913, and I don't know the source of her income after that. But nonetheless, she is dressed very fashionably in this hat and the long fashionable coat for the winter, and surrounded by people who look like they're from a different socioeconomic group. So Cabot's left Fertilla with, as he said, $700 from the sale of the store in 1925. You know, I didn't happen to mention before, but you know that he was divorced sometime in the early 20s. We don't know exactly when, and we don't officially know a reason, but he and Mamie did divorce early in the 20s. So as a bachelor, at the age of 42, he went on his great 8-month travels, first through Central America and then across the Atlantic on a slow boat. And one of the great things that we got from Lori, Cabot's granddaughter's collection, is his handwritten journal of that tour to Europe. We didn't know this existed until about a year ago, or less than a year ago. It's 416 pages in his handwriting, and a lot of the pages are illustrated just like this one is. And I think it's significant that we don't have any photographs of that trip. My personal theory, I have no proof of this at all, but my feeling is that this was a painting trip. He took this trip to become a better painter, and photography was just not on his mind. At any rate, at this point, we don't have photographs, but we do have the journal. The previous page, let me just make one remark about these illustrations, is that this page 409, is very close to the end of the journal. And it's when Cabot is on his way home, and he's not thinking about Europe and being sorry that he left it. He's thinking about the desert that he is delighted to be coming back to, because this is where his heart always was. And so on his way back from Europe, he's making little sketches, and what it says is just ideas for cabin on the desert. So that's what he's thinking about, is building more homestead cabins, just like he did in 1913 at the end of 1925. And then just briefly, these are a couple of the larger sketches of Parisian life that he was doing when he was just walking around. The violin player was playing with a tin can or a cup for donations, and then someone asleep on the park bench. This is a real treasure, and we hope to be able to publish it, a transcription of that document at some point in the fairly near future. There's a lot of his character in that journal. From the return in 1926 of Cabot to Southern California, he didn't go back to Fertilla, and he did not come back to live in the Desert Hot Springs area. Instead, he got into a little general store that he ran for a few years in Moore Park over in Ventura County, and we do have more photographs to show us just what the life was like there, with Cabot and his mother Nellie again, and she would be in early 70s in some of these photos, but this is the house that Cabot lived in. Nellie spent a part of each of her years at Laguna Beach, but then she also came up to Moore Park from time to time to take care of her son, as she had out in Fertilla. So this is the little house or cabin that they lived in there. And then this is a really big chapter for us who specialize in Cabot Yerxa. And really, since I've been giving tours just the last few years, this is a whole discovery subject. When I started giving tours, we didn't know that this portion of Cabot's life even existed. But he did not come back from Moore Park back to the Desert Hot Springs area and start building the Pueblo immediately. And we had missed that. We did not know for a long time that he ran a trading post on the east end of Miracle Hill, where he lived in a little, what he called a ranch house next to it. So in 1937, he rents out the Moore Park store, comes back, and has built this house to live in, and this is going to become, in the subsequent photograph, the trading post. And this great photo here shows kind of the complete ensemble with the house, the trading post, and Cabot Yerxa wearing these amazing chaps that I don't think he ever actually needed them, but he did need them for the photograph, just like that. And then the Ramada, and there's a closer photo, the chaps, my favorite part, and Cabot Yerxa trading post, ring bell for proprietor. And you know, it's at this trading post that a lot of the stories that we have associated with the Pueblo actually took place. This is where the snake pit was. Okay, there were never any snakes. Don't let anybody tell you there were snakes at the Pueblo. But here, as part of the business, there was a reptile pit, and he would go down and pick one up if you wanted for a 50 cents or $1 extra and lecture on a rattlesnake. And this is also where he met Hollywood. This is where Lionel Barrymore first encountered Cabot Yerxa and began to spread the word among the other celebrities at the nearby B-Bar H Ranch who were staying there in the 30s. So a lot of it does have to do with that trading post and the segue between that establishment on the east end of Miracle Hill through the late 30s and early 40s. The segue, I think, is that Cabot Yerxa started talking about memorabilia from his early adventures, such as Cuba and Alaska, to the people, especially from the B-Bar H, who would stop by the trading post. And he discovered he could make a living talking about himself by pointing out these objects that he had gathered by the roadside in early days. So I think that was the inspiration for a personal museum, which is what the Pueblo became in the 1940s. We also have a number of new photographs that I think are another breakthrough of our recent discoveries. We know much more about Cabot's second wife, Portia. We have admired Portia for her influence on his life, but have not known very much about her until maybe the last 18 months or so. And so photographs here, some of these have been published and some not, in that little booklet that's now for sale at the Pueblo Trading Post. But some of them are new to us and new to you. So You know that they married in 1945, in the summer of 1945, after having met in Palm Springs, probably in 44. And Portia did not go to live with Cabot immediately in the Pueblo because it hadn't been built yet. It was under construction through the 40s. So the first place they lived was at this ranch on the east end of Miracle Hill. And here's Portia, ring bell for storekeeper right down here. So she's sitting in the same place we saw in the previous photo. And then here are the two of them together, probably around the age of 60 for both of them. This would be sometime in the mid-1940s, and this is the Pueblo in the background under construction. Judy will talk a lot more about that pretty soon. But you know, one part of Portia's reputation in our storytelling until recently had been kind of a misconstrual, kind of a mistake about Portia's character or personality. And here you can see she was not shy about digging in. Look at the dust on her shoes, okay? She was a lady, but she was also somebody who was a worker, a physical worker too. And of course you recognize the scene here. This is Portia after the living room of the Pueblo has been constructed, and she's reading a book there. And here, we weren't clear on how much she might have participated in the operation of the Pueblo as a paying museum, but here she is seated in that first room, which we've called the water room. That's the room that the tours just begin in the Pueblo. But here she is sitting amongst the knickknacks, the memorabilia that was for sale, and presumably she would sell you a ticket for 50 cents so you could take a museum tour as well. I think that's an excellent photo. This is a completely different atmospheric shot. Again, probably sometime in the 1950s, and this is in the main kitchen downstairs, but the light and shadows make a very different impression. So I love the expression and the light there. I wanted to just say about that refrigerator. These photographs can be very informative. The refrigerator is different from the one that's now in the museum, and this is kind of, for those of us who give the tours, this is big news. I guess I just wanted you to know. And then one of the classic photos, a portrait of the two of them, probably the late 1950s, showing how Cabot dressed as a museum docent and how Portia did not dress the same way.
Okay, so this brings us to the Pueblo. Very familiar photograph that you all are very familiar with. We kind of know the story. We do know now, though, that he started to build this Pueblo around 1941. Okay, while he and Portia were living up at the trading post. We know that the Pueblo was built out of reclaimed materials. He took apart old buildings and all to help build this Pueblo. But we really didn't know how he went about doing it. And then we got some of Laurie's photos together. We had talked about the fact that he'd excavated into the hillside. This is a photograph of that early excavation. He dug into this hillside and built a 75-foot retainer wall to support the Pueblo against the hillside. It took him almost a year to dig into that hillside. Then he took all those reclaimed boards from all those abandoned homes, and he built the wood frame of the Pueblo. Once he had that construction up, he wrapped everything in tar paper. Then he nailed up chicken wire on top of the tar paper, and then he slapped up all the cement that we're all familiar with today. And you can see, look at these great cars. This is what he hauled the stuff back and forth from all of the abandoned homes. Doesn't look like it in this photograph, but he really staged stuff. He had big piles of lumber, a 12-foot pile and a 10-foot pile, and he said if the 12-foot pile was bigger than the 10-foot pile, the next room was a 12-foot room. Because he didn't like to cut up wood because he knew that was wasteful. He wasn't going to be able to use it. He took doorknobs and hinges and window frames, you know, and he laid it all over here. It's a great, great photograph of all the materials that he used. And then I love this one. All these adobe bricks that he made, every one of them by hand. And this guy, by the time he's at this point in the building of the Pueblo, he's in his mid-60s, and he's climbing up this ramp to lay some of those adobe bricks. This is a great photograph. Cabot inside his Pueblo. probably up on the second floor. We don't have that open to the public today, but talking about all of his wonderful artifacts and all. This one's my favorite. This is the only photo that we've ever seen of the Pueblo as that earthen room, the room with the dirt floor, as it looked during Cabot's time. And this little pot sits in that same spot today.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful, and you can kind of picture that, you know, enjoying that. And this one, well, the sign's a little different today, but the words haven't changed a bit. There's no place just like this, place anywhere near this place, so this must be the place, and there's Cabot. and he's got a tortoise in his hands. We learned that he had a number of tortoises at the Pueblo, and he would bring them out and talk to people about them. Now, we kind of knew about Eagle's Nest too. We'd heard about it, we'd seen it, but we didn't know a lot about it till we found this photograph. This is Eagle's Nest 2. This was a home that we believe Cabot started to build around the mid to late 50s. A second home. A second home. And on the back side of this photograph, Portia is writing to her sister Vedas. And she's saying, when Cabot finishes this one, we'll move up 250 feet in the desert. So they were planning to move up to this Eagle's Nest 2 and to live there. We can't talk about the Pueblo without talking about Cole Leroy. We wouldn't have the Pueblo if it wasn't for Cole. We're still doing a lot of research on Cole so we can properly tell his story. But Cole's stewardship lasted 25 years at this Pueblo. And one of the most important events that he had was the Waiokea carving. Love this photograph. That's Cole's on the crane as they're lifting this feather to put it up in place on top of Waiokea. At the dedication, the keynote speaker was Dennis Banks. Dennis Banks was one of the original organizers of the American Indian movement. He came to this dedication for the dedication itself, but more importantly for Cabot. He actually said to John Yerxa, I came here because Cabot spoke well of our people and we respected him. So we hope to be able to gather much more information. We've got some interviews lined up to learn more about Cole's life, and eventually we'll be able to tell his story. So that pretty much ends the presentation tonight, folks. I hope you enjoyed. Back there. We're open for questions and comments. I know we're running short of time, Audrey, so...
I think it's okay. It's okay, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
So if there's any questions or comments, yes.
How old is his granddaughter?
Lori's in her early 60s. And she and I become quite close friends, actually. Yeah. And she has 2 sons that live out here in California. And at the 100th celebration that we just did this past June, we had 3 generations of Yerxes there. Lori came, brought her 2 sons and all the grandkids. It was a really special time. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
I was just wondering, are you going to be able to show these pictures visually at the Pueblo as part of the tour? As part of the tour, or?
Well, we do have some of the photographs on exhibit at the Pueblo that are part of the tour.
I know that, but these are so great.
Yeah, they really are. What we'd like to do, hopefully at some point, is to really have a whole display of his photographs. The second floor of the Pueblo, which is not being used today, would be a wonderful place to do photographic exhibits. Right now, we just, Pat Larson's company just finished a wonderful film on Cabot's. We premiered it at the Camelot Theater this past December, and we have that playing at the Pueblo so people can see the history of it. It's really great. We had a super time doing it.
I could also add to that as time goes on, we are hoping to introduce additional publications, and as we do more publications, of course, we have many more photos now to draw on, so I think some of the more interesting ones are going to make their way into the public. For example, the second edition of this, well, you know, we sold out of the first edition, so it's somewhat revised for the second edition, and we have a few new photos in the second edition of On the Desert. And this winter, we're putting together a little book, in some ways the same size, but not so thick, of biographies of 4 of Cabot's family members, which we have not been able to do much research on until lately. But the book coming out this winter will have biographies of his 2 parents and both of his wives, and it will be very generously illustrated with new photos. And then as time goes on, we're hoping for other publications. The Alaska subject certainly invites publication, and I've already mentioned that the European Journal invites the idea of publishing. So I think we want to make as many of these available to the public, but you have to kind of figure out how to do it. So it's not all just tonight. You know.
Well, I would like to say that the video that we produced has quite a lot of these historic photos.
Yeah, it's really great. The video is $10, and it runs around 20, 25 minutes, I think, something like that. Was there another question? Did I see it? Yes.
What happened to his brother?
Harry. Well, when the freeze hit Riverside County and they lost their orange ranch, Cabot tried to find work and kind of traveled all over the country, and Harry stayed behind and worked at the stores. And he married, and he and his wife Edna had 1 child, Janetta. And one of the interviews that we did was of Janetta's son, Harry's grandson, up in Bear Lake, Howard Lowell. And he supplied us with a number of photographs. In fact, it was so early on in our research that we need to go back because I think we missed a lot of stuff. But he died at a fairly young age, unfortunately. Yes?
Did Cabot have more than 1 child?
No. No, just had Rodney, and Rodney married Marguerite, and they of course had Lori, just 1 child. And actually Rodney, shortly after Mamie, Cabot's first wife, died, Rodney and his wife Marguerite came to the Pueblo for the first time. They actually spent 6 months there. And they helped Cabot build part of that Pueblo, particularly where they're laying down the telephone poles and all. And once Lori was born, they were living in Los Gatos.
Oakland.
Sorry?
I think they were living in Oakland, East.
In Oakland. And they would come down every Easter with Lori. And they would spend Easter vacation at the Pueblo with Cabot and Portia. Yes?
When was the time when Cabot met all the kind of interesting people like Buffalo Bill, and I understand he got invitations from Eisenhower, and things like that. Did that happen throughout his life, or mainly in one period?
Yeah, it happened pretty much throughout his life. We've just made a wonderful contact. I think a fellow by the name of Bob Forrester. Bob spent time with Cabot and Portia when he was 5 and 8 years old. Cabot kind of took him under the wing. His mom was working at Angel View as a volunteer, and the boys were running amok over there, and they were trying to find some place to keep them safe. And so this woman by the name of Wagner introduced this Bob Forrester to Cabot and Portia, and Bob spent a number of years in his early life, and then later came back and spent time with Cole, like 4 or 5 years with Cole. So we learned a lot from Bob, and he heard stories, remembered wonderful stories that Cabot had told, and we had heard the Buffalo Bill stories. We couldn't confirm it for sure, and we had this one chair that we thought was the Buffalo Bill chair, but we couldn't confirm it. And here Bob's saying he heard from Cabot that they had actually met Buffalo Bill, that they used to go to his shows and they could go backstage. Now, where he's 3 when he's out there in Hamilton, which would have been where they've been together. But perhaps, they came back or whatever, but we're pretty sure that in his early life he was connected with Buffalo Bill. And of course it was during his military career that he was Eisenhower's mess sergeant and clerk. Yes. Yes?
Is Rodney still alive?
No, he passed away in '85, sadly, and his wife passed away within 6 months after he did.
Question.
Yes?
The cigars that he sold in Alaska, had he been to Cuba before that?
No.
How did the cigars?
The big stores that, which the photographs of the large stores that they had in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they actually had a cigar department in that store, and they advertised cigars made before your very eyes. So we believe he took a number of those cigars with him to Alaska. Plus we know he went into Chicago and bought a number of supplies there. He actually ended up taking like 50,000 cigars to Alaska with some pipes and tobacco and all. Yeah. So they were mostly coming from the store in Minneapolis, we believe. Anything else? Yes.
We want to thank you for coming. Ginger, did you have something?
I have something to say. As you can tell, that there are a lot of exciting things going on at Cabot, and our volunteers, our district committee are doing phenomenal work researching all of this. We also have some more exciting things going on. This weekend we have carvers and weavers from Oaxaca, Mexico there, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's spectacular. They set up today and you can't believe how beautiful it is. So come by and take a look. This is a new event for Cabot. We'll have Mona Ortiz the end of February, our 5th year with the Potters here. And then in April, another brand new event, Hopi Kachina Carvers will be coming to demonstrate and have their things at Cabot. So come and check out these events this spring.
One of these events this weekend, Saturday and Sunday?
Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
So if you've not toured Cabot's, now is your chance. More and more data. There's one thing about true historians and true researchers. We're not afraid to change the facts. When more accurate data is presented. It's the key thing. It's not when it's more interesting, John. Now, to wrap up our night tonight, I would like us to get our raffle tickets.